filtering in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll be recording today's talk. Hello and welcome. I'm Laura Albert. I'm a professor of industrial engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm here today to talk about bracketology. I will keep the talk to about 45 minutes and answer some questions at the end, knowing that some of you might have a 1 o'clock meeting. All right, so this talk is in 3 parts today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Badger bracketology and the analytics work that I do in sports analytics at the beginning to give you an appreciation of how math can be used to understand more about the NCAA bracket. And I'll have a brief segment in the middle where I'll discuss seeding the tournament because that's very important for understanding how to fill out a bracket. And then at the end, I'll spend some time talking about the analytics of bracketology. I will try to answer questions at the end. You can feel free to add questions in the chat at any time or to raise a question at the end of the talk. All right, so let's get started. So as you know, at this point, I'm an industrial and systems engineering professor, and you may be wondering why industrial engineers care about bracketology. In truth, we think about designing and operating better systems, where a system is a set of things that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own behavior over time. And those things can be composed of people, vehicles, even basketball teams or football conferences. And all of those are types of systems. Industrial engineers study many types of industries that are consequential for our economy, including manufacturing, healthcare, finance, logistics, and transportation. And what we often do is leverage data to extract the most insights and the most meaning from that data so that we can use that to take action and make better decisions. And so, gleaning information from data is central to what we've been doing for now more than 100 years. All right, so I promised you that sports leagues are an interconnected system. This is a graph of the 2014 college football season where there's a line connecting teams that played each other. I chose this old conference because you can see the old conferences are more conferences, and you can see that they're tightly connected. And then there are the interconference games that connect those clusters. And in addition to the game outcomes and the data that we can see from teams, the structure of who played who gives us a lot of information. For one, it can help us determine strength of schedule. And if you're wondering where Wisconsin is, there we are. All right, so I've been involved in Badger bracketology for more than a decade now. I got started in 2014, which was the first year of the college football playoff, and I developed an analytical method based on statistics and simulation to forecast the college football playoff. And specifically, I looked at the remaining schedule to forecast who is the most likely teams or set of teams to make the playoff. And I've been doing a little bit more every year since then. On a weekly basis, I use analytical methods to rank sports teams, including college football, also now the National Football League teams, as well as the college men's and women's basketball, just Division I. In addition to that, I bring a lot of these methods into the classroom. As you can imagine, a lot of students find sports analytics really interesting and motivating and inspires some to dig a little bit deeper into course material. And that's a lot of fun for me as well. So I teach sports decision-making examples and have developed win probability models. So even last week in my course, I had students work on a win probability for women's soccer using World Cup data. And I also take the opportunity to talk to the media about sports analytics and industrial engineering. All right, so let's talk about how to rank sports teams. And I will use what I do at Badger bracketology as an example, and I'll give you some insight into other ways we can rank sports teams. Okay, so let's return to our picture of a college football season where you have these graphs of interconnected teams. And imagine that you're trying to figure out who the best teams are. So you can just randomly pick a team, which is not a really great way to pick a the best team by random, but we'll start with any random team. And you can then randomly move to one of the teams that it plays. So you can look at these arcs connecting the teams in the picture, and you might want to move to a team that beats that team that you started at. So you randomly move to the winners of various games, and you keep doing that. And soon you end up visiting teams like Wisconsin, which typically wins a lot of games each season, and other of the best teams. And so that leverages the structure, but also the data of what happened in individual games. And it gives us a metric of like how frequently we visit each team as a way of ranking sports teams. Okay, so how does this work? It's pretty neat. So I'll talk to you with a specific example. So especially in the old conference alignment, when there are more conferences, teams in basketball were very likely to play each other twice a season. And so that gives you 2 data points for that same pair of teams. And what they do is they play at one team's home court first, and then they switch and they play at the other team's home court in the second game. And that gives you some information here. And essentially what we're trying to do is try to figure out who's the best team, but not just look at wins and losses, look at the score differential. Like, so how much credit should a team get for a victory? And so I'll look at the Wisconsin-Minnesota matchup. So a couple years ago, they played in January of that year, and Wisconsin won by 6. And this game was played here in Madison. So it was a home game for Wisconsin. And there's a notable home field advantage that I can take into account when doing the numbers. And you can see these arrows between the 2 teams. There's 4 total errors, but they're all determined by this parameter that I just called W on this slide, which is kind of the fraction of the win that Wisconsin gets. And then Minnesota would get the rest of the fraction of the win. Okay, so this is a 6-point victory in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin benefited from home field advantage. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we assess how much of the win Wisconsin should get? Well, let's use the data for this. Let's have the data tell us what the answer is. Okay, so what I've done here is I've taken all the games in a season where teams play twice. And on the x-axis, I look at the score differential in the first game, which was 6 for the example that I just gave you. And in the y-axis, we look at the score differential in the next game. And so that game would be played in Minnesota. And you'll see this like plus sign here in the graph because games don't end in a tie. So that's where the zeros are. And you'll see this like upward trend of all these data points. So there's a lot of correlation. Teams that win the first game tend to win the second game. And that's what I have in this upper right quadrant. And you can also think about those teams that win the first game, but then lose the second game when they're playing an away game. And that's in the lower right quadrant. And actually, there's a lot of data points there. So that's a little tricky for us. And then we can specifically look at the case that we're interested in. So the team that wins on their home court by 6 points in the first game. And that gives you this vertical slice of the data. And you can see there's probably roughly an equal number of points above and below that horizontal white bar and that plus sign there. So that's a little discouraging. All right, but let's use statistics here. So what I use is I use logistic regression, which is a real workhorse in data science and AI. And we put this all together and we predict that the probability that Wisconsin would beat Minnesota in the next game using all of our past data as a for this prediction. And this little green dot here tells us this probability, which tells us, unfortunately, that Wisconsin has a 48% chance of beating Minnesota on the road in the next game. So why does that go down so much? Well, Wisconsin had home field or home court advantage in the first game. And not only do they lose it for the next game, but Minnesota gains home court advantage. And we take that into account. If they played that next game on a neutral court, Wisconsin would have a 55% chance of winning. Okay, so that's how that works. And that allows us to assign partial votes to a winning team. I do a little bit more with this to account for teams that actually win or lose the game. And I use this in a model based on Markov chains to rank teams. But I like this approach because it leverages specific data as well as structure from the season. And we don't need many data points, but we can use this to make good rankings. Okay, so I do repeat this procedure for every game in the data set and I end up building a large matrix and use linear algebra to solve our set of equations from Markov chains. And that gives me like a score for each team, and I simply sort that score to get the rankings. And that's pretty much how all the rankings work. And in case you're wondering, Wisconsin did beat Minnesota later that season by 1 point, but a win's a win. And that was a great victory for Wisconsin. Markov chains are a mathematical model that we use a lot in industrial engineering. They're the source of queuing theory of all things, but they also contribute billions of dollars to our economy every year. They're the basis of internet search. When Google introduced a Markov chain-empowered search engine in the late 90s, it revolutionized internet search overnight. It's also the basis of autocomplete. And it's used widely in generative AI. So it can help us randomly make choices in Generate AI to generate text or images or whatever we want. Okay, going back to sports analytics, there are a number of different models and methods out there, and there are some big differences between them. They all have a couple things in common. They take a source of inputs and input data, and then we use methods or models. So I use Markov chains and logistic regression. And then they output a set of ratings that can be sorted into a ranking. Now, you can use different types of data. I use pretty simple box score data for my rankings. So point score differentials, which tells me who won and lost the game, as well as where the game was played. Very simple methods use just wins and losses. And you can also use Markov chains for that, as well as Colley matrices. So the Colley matrix has been used to rank college football teams for a while, and it's even been used by the selection committees. Logistic regression and RPI, which is not my favorite ranking method, but that's based on just wins and losses. What I do at Badger Bracketology falls more under the scoring methods because I take the actual score into account, which you can also use Markov chains for, as well as Poisson regression and other type forms of regression. Pythagorean scoring, which hails back to Major League Baseball analytics, and the Massey ratings. And there are a few others out there. And you can even rely on your gut occasionally, like the coaches and press polls. And I have a bit of a crowdsourcing element to my college football rankings because there's just fewer data points over a short season. Both the NCAA selection committees and the college football playoff committees look at some computer rankings. So they call these analytics-based rankings computer rankings. And the specific rankings they've looked at year to year vary. But it is helpful that these are some additional data points that have influence into how the teams are selected. All right, so at this point, you might be wondering, what's the difference between men's and women's basketball, or are the results mostly the same? And there are some differences. So this is this scatter plot that I showed you earlier of the score differentials between the two games when teams play each other twice in a season. You can see there's that upward trend, some correlation between the first and second games, but you also see a lot of variation in those scores. The women's data looks slightly different. You also see the overall trend, but you see less variance. And so there's a little bit more predictive ability from the women's data set. So I do use different data for the different rankings. I use the sports-specific data. And the women's game, the logistic regression curve looks a little bit different. That's the red curve here. And the men's logistic regression curve is the blue line. Okay, so what does this mean? Let's take a team that wins by a lot in that first game. So they win by 20. In the men's game, that tells us that that same team will win their next game about 73% of the time. But for women, if they win by 20 in the first game, they have an 80% chance of winning their next game. So it gives us some greater confidence. And we'll see this as a theme when we compare the men's game to the women's game, is that the men's game tends to be a little bit more unpredictable than the women's game. And that has some implications for filling out a bracket. All right, so some takeaways from ranking is that you don't actually need much data to create rankings as long as you use a good model. So Markov chains for me. And to me, this is actually pretty beautiful that with just a few data points and a good model, I can create rankings that are indistinguishable from those of experts. And that really is beautiful and something that I can appreciate. And it tells us about the power of data. If we leverage it, we can get a lot of mileage out of our data, not just for sports analytics, but for other applications as well. All right, next I want to tell you about seeding the tournament, and we'll step through this, and I'll end with some takeaways for how to fill out a bracket based on how this process works. The men's and women's tournaments are seeded in mostly the same ways. I'll tell you the differences for the women's after stepping through the process for the men's tournament. So both tournaments at this point have 68 teams, and about half of the teams automatically qualify. These are the teams that win their conference or their conference championship game. And then the selection committee reviews and first determines who's in or out. And they use the NCAA's net computer rankings to rank the team or to have some extra data points when choosing those teams. In the past, they've also used some other computer rankings. Then what they do is that they rank the teams first through 68th. And so this is actually kind of a labor-intensive process where they move teams up and down and they vote. This is called the S curve. And they try to get what they call a team's true seed, which is going to be 1 to 16. And those 1 to 16 seeds then become and get placed in the regions when they fill out the whole bracket. But this is before they look at a bracket at all. And then step 3 is trying to fill out the bracket. And this is actually a really tough part of the process. And what they do in the men's tournament is this also determines where a team will play. So they'll fill out the bracket and then they'll assign these sets of 4 teams to a certain location called pods. But they're different locations where the tournament is played, which is played at so-called neutral sites. And they do try to balance the overall strength of each region by going back to that S curve in step number 2. Okay, so why is this process so hard? Well, it's so hard because they have so many constraints that they must satisfy. There's a long list of them. The slide would be very cluttered with text if I listed all the requirements, but basically it's teams that can't play in the first round or first 3 rounds or even the same region. And this is incredibly restrictive in creating the bracket. And sometimes it's impossible to satisfy those constraints. So more on that in a second. The other thing they need to do is also think about assigning those locations to the pods to the teams in the bracket, is that the first 4 seeds, so the 1 through 4 in each region, can't be at a home crowd disadvantage. So they don't necessarily have to play close to their university, but they're going to play pretty close to their university generally, especially the 1 seed, which generally the 1 seeds are playing at the closest pod. So they have not been able to satisfy all of these constraints in the past, and sometimes what this means is they have to adjust the seed of a team. And so they can move a seed up or down, our team up or down by 1 seed typically, and occasionally they've had to do this by 2 seeds to satisfy all the constraints that are required. And so that's why they sometimes talk about the true seed versus the seed that the team might actually be assigned at the end. So occasionally you might be wondering, like, this seed seems like this team isn't seeded right, and maybe it wasn't seeded right, but they had to satisfy constraints. And just a group of 4 from the bracket, will take a number 1 seed here, Duke, was assigned to play in Raleigh. So they'll play their first 2 rounds in Raleigh against American University in DC or Mount St. Mary's, which is in Maryland. So it's a very close game for that 16 seed. And then Mississippi State and Baylor also are assigned to Raleigh. And I looked on the map, it takes 22 minutes to drive from Duke to Raleigh. So basically it's going to be a home game for Duke, but that gives Duke potentially a huge home field advantage for those first two games. And it's not always the case for all 1 through 4 seeds. I like to look at the locations, but sometimes it can be a substantial benefit. The main difference between seeding the women's tournament and the men's tournament is that the women's tournament is actually played at the home stadium of the 1 through 4 seeds. Those are the hosts. And so it's not just like a home game for those top seeds. It actually is a home game, and it lasts for those first 2 rounds. So for example, here is a little snippet of the women's bracket. Texas is a 1 seed, so they're going to play a home game in Austin at their stadium against High Point or William and Mary. So both of those are in the Mid-Atlantic. And then also Illinois and Creighton are also sent to Austin. It's not too far away for those teams. The women's selection process also lists a lot more data that they'd like their committee to look at. So I like that transparency, and I like the use of data. So they look at things like, of course, the overall record and strength of schedule, but also bad losses, significant wins, common opponents and head-to-head outcomes. Okay, so some takeaways is that the seeds tell you a lot, but sometimes some seeds might be a little bit off to satisfy those tournament constraints. So it's worth looking at the specific quality of those teams. And I also look at the location in the men's tournament because some teams are really close to having a home court advantage, and some it's more neutral. And with the women's tournament, there's a huge advantage to being a 1 through 4 seed, especially in the first 2 rounds of the tournament. And we'll see how that plays out in the actual tournament upsets later on. It's also worth noting for the teams that make it to the Final Four, the men's Final Four will be in San Antonio, Texas, which can be a boost to teams in that vicinity, such as Houston. And the women's tournament Final Four is going to be in Tampa, Florida this year. So in the women's game, the home team wins 60% of all games with a 5-point margin of victory. This is a pretty substantial home court advantage that it helps brackets when you take that into account. All right, so now let's look at specific bracketology and what the numbers tell us about the tournament. And we'll look at historic tournament, looking at kind of when there's been a round of 64 and knowing which has been, I think, 39 tournaments for the men's season and at least 30 for the women's tournament. Okay, so let's look at just the first round. And I have the 8 different kinds of matchups in the first round. And you'll see the probability here that the lower seed wins. So one thing you'll notice is that only twice has a 1 seed lost in the first round. So Virginia was upset by UMBC, and Purdue was upset a couple years ago by Fairleigh Dickinson. So overall, that tells us that the low seed wins 1.28% of those 1 versus 16 games. As you look down this chart, you'll notice that there are more and more upsets as you go down. When you get to a 6 versus 11 or 7 through 10 seed matchups, the lower seed wins about 40% of the time. So it's almost evenly matched. And the 8 versus 9 is basically a toss-up. The women's tournament numbers look a little different. One thing you'll notice is that there's only been one upset of a 1 seed by a 16 seed, but a 2 or 3 seed has never lost in the first round. So fewer upsets in the women's tournament. And at this point, you know that those teams are playing home games on their home court, and that might be contributing to some of these numbers we see here with very few upsets. We also see in the women's game that 8 to 9 is basically a toss-up. So it's within 1 percentage point of 50% for those games. We also see a lot of 7 through 10 upsets, almost as many as in the men's game. Okay, so now we can look at the different seeds, our 16 seeds, and see how far those teams go throughout the tournament. So as you go right on this chart, you'll eventually get to whoever is the champion of the tournament. And we'll look at a couple of things on this chart. We'll start by looking at 13 through 16 seeds here at the bottom. So as you go right, you'll notice that we hit a lot of zeros right away. So only one time has a 15 seed made the Elite Eight, and that's it. 13 through 16 seeds have not made it very deep into the tournament. You can contrast this with the 1 through 4 seeds. And you'll see not only do they go very far through the tournament, the 1 seeds in particular are overwhelmingly the champions of the tournament. We can look at the distribution of seeds in the Final Four and the national championship game. And the Final Four is mostly comprised of 1 through 4 seeds. Historically, they've accounted for more than 80% of the Final Four teams. And you'll see these numbers drop pretty low as we go down. Okay, so what does this tell us practically when we're filling out a bracket? So in a typical year in the men's tournament, we'll have 2 1 seeds, a 2 seed, and like a 3 or a 4 seed in the Final Four. So I try to keep that composition in mind when I'm choosing teams in my bracket. And only one time have all 1 seeds made the Final Four in the men's tournament. You'll notice here that the winner of the tournament, 64% of the time, has been a 1 seed, and yet there are only 6% of the teams in the tournament. So by and large, 1 seeds win the national championship. We've had teams as low as an 8 seed win the national championship. In the women's tournament, we'll see many fewer upsets. So we'll see here that the 1 seeds win 73% of the national championships, and a team lower than a 3 seed has never won the tournament. So when I fill out a women's bracket, many fewer upsets. All right, let's just look at the last 10 tournament winners and their seeds just as a review. So for the men's tournament, number 1, UConn won last year, and 6 of the last 10 tournaments, a 1 seed won the tournament, right in line with those statistics. The women's tournament, 7 out of the last 10 years, a 1 seed has won the tournament. See UConn a lot in both of the championship lists for men and women. All right, so let's talk about upsets, because this is usually what affects our bracket and how we do in our pools. So we'll focus specifically on low seeds, which I'll define as seeds 6 through 16. This is the entire list of low seeds that have ever made the Final Four. As you look at this list, you'll notice a lot of 6 and 11s on it. That's not an accident. You'll see NC State from last year. If you look at really low seeds, so double-digit seeds that are 10 through 16, they've only made the Final Four 6 times. And every single time, they were an 11 seed. There's something special about that 6 and 11 spot. The 11 seeds are the ones that break your bracket. And there's some theories about this, that maybe the 6 and 11 seed goes the furthest without playing a 1 seed or a 2 seed. And that might be why they're able to go so deep into the tournament, yet not have so many upsets in the first round. Same amount of upsets as a 7-10 seed, for example. When we look at the women's tournament, we see a very short list of low seeds that have made the Final Four. So just 5 teams ever, no double-digit seeds. Okay, many fewer upsets, again, in the women's tournament. I'm also often asked about power conferences, and I'm realizing that the conferences are shifting every single year. So this data doesn't have the most recent couple of seasons, but it looks at how far in the tournament the teams from major conferences have made it, including the AAC at some point. But you'll notice here that especially when you look at the Sweet 16, more than 80% of the teams in the Sweet 16 are from major conferences, and 100% of the winners have been from major conferences. And so typically those teams from major conferences tended to be seeded higher, and that explains a lot of this, that those teams might be favored to go deep into the tournament. But I also try to balance, have some balance in my bracket when trying to pick upsets, but maybe not too many. A little bit more Final Four math for your bracket enjoyment. All one seeds have advanced to the Final Four in both the women's and the men's tournament. Happened one time for the men, but 3 times for the women. All 1 through 4 seeds have advanced to the Sweet 16, so essentially having no upsets by the time that there's a Sweet 16. That happened one time for the women. We haven't really been close for the men. And undefeated teams have won the tournament, but only in the women's tournament, since there have been at least 64 teams in the tournament. 4 undefeated teams in the men's tournament have reached the men's tournament undefeated, but did not win. And 16 teams that were undefeated were in the tournament for the women. And more than half the times, 9 times, those teams won the tournament. And we're looking at 1 seeds, which requires some special consideration when filling out a bracket since they tend to go so far into the tournament. A 1 seed advances to the Sweet 16 84% of the time for the men's tournament. So like every other year, there's a 1 seed that doesn't make the Sweet 16. But a 1 seed makes the Sweet 16 97% of the time in the women's tournament. So it's almost a sure thing. There's slight difference in the most common seeds in the Final Four. For the men's tournament, as I mentioned earlier, it's like 2 1 seeds, a 2 seed, and a 3 or 4 seed. So last year we had a 1, 1, a 4, and an 11 seed. So a little bit different, but still kind of close to this pattern. And for the women's tournament, it's usually 3 seeds and then a 2 or a 3 seed. So last year, 2 1 seeds and 2 3 seeds. And by and large, a 1 seed wins the national championship. So 63% of the time for the men and 73% of the time for the women. So it's usually a pretty good bet. And then one final note on seeds. So seeds don't tell you a lot specifically about the team, but they also tell you about a path to the Final Four, because you know essentially what teams you could play to get to the Final Four. And so just that seed yields some information. So 11 and 10 seeds have the same rate of upsets in their first round of games, and yet we've only seen 11 seeds make it to the Final Four, and we've never seen a 10 seed make it to the Final Four. So those are the ones that break your bracket, and sometimes 6 to 11 matchups in that first round require a little bit more attention and a little bit more research when filling out a bracket. I appreciate your attention. I just have a couple of final slides before I wrap things up. And I want to tie this back into engineering. And engineers are really interested in understanding how a system can perform in an uncertain environment, and also how to make that system perform even better. We also like to leverage data to make predictions in the presence of uncertainty, because we live in an uncertain world. And we're also interested in learning from data, especially without a human in the loop. So a lot of what we're able to do with these computer rankings. And bracketology helps us understand these topics well, and it's a lot of fun. So in both bracketology and engineering, we want to leverage our data and get the most insight and information and knowledge from that data. And then we actually want to go one step further and take actions with that data to engineer better systems. So that's why engineers care about bracketology and sports analytics. So with that, I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Laura, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Joe. By the way, thanks for this. This is great. I double MS'd in engineering and one of them is in statistics. So
Great.
I've saved companies hundreds of millions of dollars doing data analytics. But the question I have is, now that we have a collection of number ones all in the final four, how do we determine the probability of which one is more likely to win?
Yeah, so that's where I look at the rankings particularly and I look at my own, but then also some other rankings to see who's really that overall number one seed and how strong is that. So that often influences me in picking one team over another that's a one seed. I also might look at the specific matchups in that bracket. So one of those regions has the best two seed, and sometimes I don't choose that one seed in that bracket as my overall winner, or from that region is the overall winner, because that I try to look at that path to the final four. There's a question in the chat. Most of your information is based on historical data to predict future outcomes. Do you have the ability to forecast seasons into the future, or is the uncertainty of recruiting too much to include? I don't, but one can do that. Of course, when you're leveraging data, it's always taking a view to the past. And it's one thing that really differentiates engineers from statisticians, is engineers are really focused on the future. So I really like this question because I am also focused on the future. So a lot of times that's why we leverage mathematical models in our research, because those help us really predict based on modeling by making some assumptions about underlying dynamics that could point to future performance. And, sometimes we can make adjustments to the data based on other times from the past where we've learned about predicting the future and what does that mean for the data that we're looking at right now. So there are some ways to do that. One way that that's used in bracketology is looking at preseason rankings. For whatever reason, preseason rankings tell us something, and it's expert opinion, it's crowdsourced, not using a lot of math. But the teams that are not in those top 25 of the preseason rankings, some of those teams that have pretty high seeds were not ranked really well at the beginning of the season, and those teams tend to be upset. And I've looked at the numbers. I didn't have it presented here, but it's pretty compelling. So Purdue a couple years ago, when they were a one seed and lost in the first round, that was an unranked or a lower ranked a team at the beginning of the season. So there are data points there, like alluding to this question, that we can use some information that tells us something about the future. And preseason rankings is one of those data sources for the tournament. Injuries are a little trickier. Often asked about injuries because that's a related issue where the historic data, you had this player that was not injured that was playing and contributing to the team. And again, we try to make good estimates also using data, but using past performances as a guide there. But we have to do some manual adaptation when we're trying to make predictions in a system that doesn't really look like it did in the past when we collected that data. Thank you for that question. Well, hearing no other questions and seeing none in the chat, guess we'll end our webinar. And again, thank you for your attention. Enjoy the tournament. Good luck, and on Wisconsin.
Thank you. Bye, Laura.
Bye-bye.